We have seen in chapter 4 how the idea effectuates the virtual half of the sufficient reason of a thing. But Deleuze still has to explain how this virtual part generates the actual part of the object. This is the topic discussed here in the final chapter of Difference and Repetition. The outline of chapter 5 is the following. First, Deleuze shows how paradox forces the idea to transcend itself. Then he shows how concepts and objects, that is, measurable quantities and sensual qualities, emerge out of the depth of the intensive abyss into the order of actual things. This passage calls for a distinction between two types of quantities, intensive and extensive, which conditions the passage from intensity to extendedness and ultimately produces the individuation of all things. Deleuze then focuses the discussion on complex systems, namely biological organisms, and he concludes his research by an analysis of the most complex system of all, the mind. So let's jump into it. As we have seen many times, difference is not given. It's not a first principle or an antecedent objective substance like mind or matter, out of which reality is formed. Rather, it is that which forms such principles. As Deleuze says, difference is not diversity, diversity is given, but difference is that by which the given is given. This act of giving is the reason why there is a fundamental asymmetry in the synthesis of the sensible. That which gives has no resemblance to that which is given. Difference does not resemble actual things. Instead, actual things are part of a special system called signal-sign, which is defined as follows. Insofar as a system is constituted or bounded by at least two heterogeneous series, two disparate orders capable of entering into communication, we call it a signal. The phenomenon that flashes across this system, bringing about the communication between disparate series, is a sign. The point is that signs do not resemble the intensity that conditions their apparition. All signs occur as the product of a difference, which is why Deleuze calls the condition of apparition of signs the unequal. We know from his book on Nietzsche that the unequal refers to the relation between active forces and reactive forces. Briefly put, active forces are pure quantities, but they are transcendental quantities, meaning that they have no units like miles per hour or degrees. They are pure forces of affirmation, the creation of a presence in actuality. However, as they fall into actuality, into space and time, if you will, they become reactive. They acquire certain units, in specific conditions that we will see. But in so doing, they impose limits and oppositions, which for Deleuze illustrates how being turns against itself. Indeed, the main characteristic of reactive forces is that they separate a force from what it can do, from its power to act. Our own empirical experience, our psychological life, cannot seize active forces, but only reactive forces as they become incarnated in signs. As Deleuze says, we know only forms of energy which are already localized and distributed in extensity, or extensity is already qualified by forms of energy. Having no access to active forces, we are condemned to what Deleuze, following Nietzsche, calls nihilism. Nihilism is the third moment of the expression of forces. It occurs when reactive forces, having exhausted all active forces available to them, turn on themselves, react on themselves, and produce negation and self-destruction. They separate themselves from their own power to separate a force from its power. In the case of ideas, this produces complete uniformization, or thinking the same thing. Overgeneralization, if you will. Nihilism is the essence of what we call good sense, which is why it is found in collective endeavors like the state apparatus, corporate culture, but also hegemonic philosophy or certain scientific theories like thermodynamics. Nihilism is the reduction of all differences to a uniform product. This is why Deleuze says, good sense is the ideology of the middle classes who recognize themselves in equality as an abstract product. It dreams less of acting than of constituting a natural milieu, the element of an action which passes from more to less differentiated. All ideologies which pretend to be universal proceed in this same manner, because as Deleuze says, good sense always implies identity in the form of a rule of universal distribution and a rule universally distributed. Behind the desire for uniformization, we always find nihilism as the ultimate product of abstract thought. But if this mechanism is inevitable, what can we do? What can philosophy in particular, which is the art of abstract thought, teach us? Should it teach us something against itself? It seems that not just philosophy, but thought in general is called to a heroic act, by which it must transcend itself and become something more than it is. In the case of philosophy, however, this necessity takes a paradoxical form. Deleuze expresses it as follows. With the identical, we think with all our force, but without producing the least thought. With the different, by contrast, do we not have the highest thought, but also that which cannot be thought? The way out of the dead end of nihilism is not the negation of thought, but a direct confrontation with what is beyond thought, namely the paradox, or that which cannot be thought. The way of the paradox holds a great promise, a pearl of great price, but it is also the most terrifying path for a philosopher since it involves the dissolution of the most basic categories of our understanding, namely subjectivity and objectivity, subject and object. As Deleuze says, subjectively, paradox breaks up the common exercise of the faculties and places each before its own limit, before its incomparable. Thought before the unthinkable, which it alone is nevertheless capable of thinking. Memory before the forgotten, which is also its immemorial. Sensibility before the imperceptible, which is indistinguishable from its intensive. At the same time, however, paradox communicates to the broken faculties that relation which is far from good sense, aligning them along a volcanic line which allows one to ignite the other, leaping from one limit to the next. Objectively, paradox displays the element which cannot be totalized within a common element, along with the difference which cannot be equalized or cancelled at the direction of a good sense. It is correct to say that the only refutation of paradoxes lies in good sense and common sense themselves, but on condition that they are already allowed everything, the role of judge as well as that of party of the case, the absolute along with the partial truth. The paradox draws great hopes, the hope to reach the truth, but with it also comes the rumor of something worrisome and potentially deadly, the abyss that looks back at us but with no eyes, something completely alien, a forced difference that could dissolve the mind in heartbeat, folly itself perhaps. We sense something which is contrary to the laws of nature. We think something which is contrary to the principles of thought. Moreover, even if the production of difference is by definition inexplicable, how can we avoid implicating the inexplicable at the heart of thought itself? How can the unthinkable not lie at the heart of thought, or delirium at the heart of good sense? So it seems that the idea is confronted to a heroic choice. On the one hand, it can choose the comfort of its own abstractions, but at the cost of remaining virtual and lifeless. Or, on the other hand, it can confront its nemesis, the depth, that is, the unthought, intensity or schizophrenia itself, but at the risk of its own coherence and integrity. This second option, which is the way of actualization, requires a rigorous analysis of the concept of depth, which is the topic of our next section. In the framework of empirical difference, madness is the undifferentiated danger, the scary monster to be confronted. But in the order of reasons, Deleuze speculates that it could in fact occur before, not after, actual experience, that is, as its condition. Perhaps good sense even presupposes madness in order to come after and correct what madness there is in any prior distribution. The objects of experience are not distinct by nature, since they all proceed from active forces which cannot be experienced. But why do they appear so in our concrete experience? How do we reconcile the fact that distinction emerges in perception and yet constitutes a principle of experience? Here, Deleuze brilliantly combines Leibniz's perspectivism with an empirical approach. The depth becomes the vector by which distinction and perception are reconciled. Examine this quote, for example. Extensity as a whole comes from the depth. Depth, as the ultimate and original heterogeneous dimension, is the matrix of all extensity, including its third dimension, considered to be homogeneous with the other two. It is as if the three-dimensional space in which we live was constructed on the basis of the two-dimensional images of our perceptions. It is in this sense that reality emerges out of the depth as a new dimension to be represented, similar perhaps to the diagonal line we often use to represent the third dimension on a 2D surface. Deleuze describes this process in which space unfolds from small differences in perspective in wonderful topographical terms. Depth is like the famous geological line from northeast to southwest, the line which comes diagonally from the heart of things and distributes volcanoes. Depth is the intensity of being, or vice versa. Out of this intensive depth, which Deleuze calls the spatium, emerge at once the extensio and the extensum, the qualitas and the quali. Extensio, the continuity of space, and extensum, finite space, appear alongside qualities like colors and temperature, both as milieu, qualitas, and as particular objects, quali, in this milieu. How does intensity produce all this? As Deleuze says, intensity has three characters: inequality, affirmation, and implication. Inequality means that what intensity is something that cannot be equalized or reduced to a representation. It is an active force, a difference in itself which gives the given, and which cannot be fixated in a representation. It is, in a nutshell, the virtual which gives, or what Deleuze calls the signal. Affirmation means that intensity, as it expresses itself in the actual world, fixates certain objects and ideas in space and time. It does so by limiting objects and ideas. As Deleuze says, extendedness puts limits to transcendental quantities in the form of assignable units, and it puts opposition in qualities. For example, if hotness or softness were not opposed by coldness and hardness, they would not be able to signify what they are. Both limitation and opposition are contained in signs. Implication means that intensity is unequal and affirmative at the same time, which implies that the difference between actuality and virtuality is not a difference of degree versus nature, or quantity versus quality, since, as we have seen, measurable quantities and sensible qualities appear in actual experience. But how can we reconcile the virtual half of a thing, by which it expresses a non-local change, and difference in general with its actual part, by which it actually has a measurable size and shape? The answer is found in the distinction between two types of quantities, intensive ones and extensive ones. As Deleuze says, the divisibility of extensive quantities is defined in the following manner: by the relative determination of a unit, this unit itself never being indivisible but only marking the level at which division ceases; by the equivalence of the parts determined by the unit; by the consubstantiality of the parts with the whole which is divided. Division can therefore take place and be continued without any change in the nature of what is being divided. For example, a segment composed of 10 units can be divided into two segments of 5 units each. This operation does not change the nature of the smaller segments. They can be added again to form a segment of 10 units. In technical terms, extensive quantity is additive for subsystems. By contrast, intensive quantities are defined as follows. When it is pointed out that a temperature is not composed of other temperatures, or a speed of other speeds, what is meant is that each temperature is already a difference, and that differences are not composed of differences of the same order, but imply series of heterogeneous terms. An intensive quantity may be divided, but not without changing its nature. This is to say that a car that travels at a speed of 60 miles per hour is not composed of 4 wheels, each going at a speed of 15. They all travel at the same speed. Similarly, a bucket that contains 2 gallons of water at 60 degrees is not composed of 1 gallon at 30 degrees plus another gallon at 30 degrees, which is to say that the magnitude or value of an intensive quantity is the same regardless of the size of the system. Intensities are made of this second type of quantities. Of course, this is only meant to be an example. Units like miles per hour or degrees already imply a certain extendedness. They are what Bergson would call impure mixtures. But they illustrate the distinction between virtuality and actuality, or intensive and extensive quantities, quite well. Now, between intensive and extensive quantities, there is a specific assignable relation. It is implication. Roughly put, intensive quantities are implicating, they give, while extensive quantities are implicated, they are given. But because the implicative relation is a relation in which the effect remains interior to the cause, meaning that all extensive quantities remain interior to intensive quantities, this means that all extensive quantities are also intensive, but not all intensive quantities are extended. Instead of a clear-cut separation, the implicative relation between intensive quantities and extensive quantities could be represented as follows. Our world of extensive quantities is like an island in a sea of change. What do intensive quantities give, exactly? To be precise, the movement of explication is the movement by which a certain non-spatial intensive depth becomes a measurable distance. Deleuze uses the term explication here because it's related to the notion of fold, like the unfolding of a sheet of paper, where 2 points that were a part of the same space now become distinct. But what is it that effectuates this unfolding, this fixation in space and time? As we have seen last time, this process is called dramatization, and it involves one of the most important aspects of our empirical life, so important in fact that it conditions it, and that is individuation. As Deleuze says, the essential process of intensive quantities is individuation. Intensity is individuating, and intensive quantities are individuating factors. Individuals are signal sign systems. All individuality is intensive and therefore serial, stepped and communicating, comprising and affirming in itself the difference in intensities by which it is constructed. Individuation is a solution to a problem, just like the eye, for example, solves a problem formulated in terms of light. But this solution takes a specific shape, which is the feedback loop or echo chamber that Deleuze calls internal resonance. Individuation emerges like the act of solving such a problem, or what amounts to the same thing, like the actualization of a potential and the establishing of communication between disparates. The act of individuation consists not in suppressing the problem, but in integrating the elements of the disparateness into a state of coupling, which ensures its internal resonance. The actual individual thus has two halves, one which is actual and the other pre-individual, and made of the singularities that compose it. As Deleuze says, in all these respects, we believe that individuation is essentially intensive and that the pre-individual field is a virtual ideal field made up of differential relations. Individuation is what responds to the question who, just as the idea responds to the questions how much and how. Who is always an intensity. Individuation is the junction between actual and virtual. It precedes differentiation with a C and creates a field, differentiation, where dramatization occurs. In this sense, individuals are not states of consciousness, neither quantities nor qualities, but rather what Deleuze calls lines. It is because of the action of the field of individuation that such and such differential relations and such distinctive points, pre-individual fields, are actualized. In other words, organized within intuition, along lines differentiated in relation to other lines. As a result, they then form the quality, number, species and parts of an individual. In short, its generality. Individuation is not a limitation, an opposition, or a specification. It is the expression of a power. But this is not limited to individuals that have a brain or a consciousness. All creatures proceed from intensive quantities. As Deleuze says, qualities and extensities, forms and matters, species and parts are not primary. They are imprisoned in individuals as though in a crystal. Moreover, the entire world may be read as though in a crystal ball, in the moving depth of individuating differences, or differences in intensity. The manner in which individuation occurs, the manner in which lines of power traverse a field of individuation are quite important. As we will see, these determine the difference between animate and inanimate objects. Deleuze uses one of his favorite figures to illustrate how these lines form a field of individuation, and this figure is the egg. The individual in the egg is a genuine descent, going from the highest to the lowest and affirming the differences which comprise it and in which it falls. The world is an egg. Deleuze presents the figure of the egg in many details, but an important question quickly emerges. If the concrete individual is determined to be what it is by virtue of its own field of individuation, does that mean that different species like wolves, seashells, or giraffes each has its own field of individuation, in which the individual members are specified? This would be a problem because it would mean that Deleuze simply replaces one abstraction, the concept of species, with another one that has a fancy name, individuation. Deleuze is of course very aware of this problem. Must we say at least that all the individuals of a given species have the same field of individuation, since they point originally to the same relation? Certainly not, for while two individuating intensities may be abstractly the same by virtue of their clear expression, they are never the same by virtue of the order of intensities which they envelop or the relations which they confusedly express. This is to say that this egg and that egg may resemble each other abstractly, in their clear expression, but the concrete processes of their distinction are by definition distinct. There are no two creatures who change in the same way, or express the exact same problems. However, we have to ask, do all systems differentiate with a C in the same manner? Deleuze argues that in fact, simple physical systems like rocks do not differentiate in the same manner as complex systems. That is the topic of our next section. We have seen how Deleuze anticipates the manifestation of difference as something anti-natural. It is in the tension between the natural and the non-natural that he formulates the problem of complex systems. On the one hand, what Deleuze calls the principle of degradation says that all physical things tend towards equilibrium. The heat death of the universe, as Deleuze says, that is predicted by one of the laws of thermodynamics, while living things tend towards biological death. As Deleuze says, intensity is explicated only in being cancelled in this differentiated system that it creates. But on the other hand, we can see that certain systems tend toward complexification and contradict the general tendency towards uniformization. Complex systems such as biological organisms and thinking beings that arise in the form of local peaks of entropy. So here's the problem. How is it possible for certain things like living organisms and thinking beings to increase entropy through the creation of new organisms or new ideas if the universe is globally reducing differences and becoming more uniform? Deleuze says this: the more complex a system, the more the values peculiar to implication appear within it. The presence of these values is what allows a judgment of the complexity or the complication of a system and determines the preceding characteristics of biological systems. The values of implication are centers of envelopment. The way in which these centers are able to locally increase entropy is by interiorizing difference and repetition in the signal sign system. To interiorize, that is, the conditions of experience. As Deleuze says, the more the difference on which the system depends is interiorized in the phenomenon, the more repetition finds itself interior, the less it depends upon external conditions which are supposed to ensure the reproduction of the same differences. As the movement of life shows, difference and repetition tend to become interiorized in signal sign systems both at once. The more complex the system, the more able it is to interiorize difference and repetition, to repeat difference instead of sameness. In this sense, the most complex systems in existence, biological systems and psychic systems, are most adequate for this operation. The psychic system thinks in the same way that the biological system lives. It reproduces as well through the dreams we have, individual or collective. In fact, in a curious expression, Deleuze says that our dreams are our eggs. But the psychic system reaches one more level of complexity than the living organism, in that it can take itself as object. It can reflect itself in the mirror of thought, where it gets objectified. This is what Deleuze means when he says, the determination of psychic species is not of the same type as the determination of biological species, since here the determination must be equal or be of the same power as the determinable. Psychic systems can become stuck, as we have seen in representations, through good sense and common sense. The way out of the dead ends of representation is, of course, the thought of eternal return, the highest and most complex operation of the mind, where the mind, after interiorizing difference and repetition, becomes able to think change itself, to repeat difference, to create novelty, or to make the determinable object equal to the determination. Thus, Deleuze says, the thinker himself makes his individual differences from all manner of things. It is in this sense that he is laden with stones and diamonds, plants and even animals. The thinker, undoubtedly the thinker of eternal return, is the individual, the universal individual. The mind constitutes itself around two special centers of envelopment, two particular ideations that are unescapable. So unescapable, in fact, that they appear to condition thought itself. These ideations are death and the other. Of death, Deleuze says this: every death is double and represents the cancellation of large differences in extension, as well as the liberation and swarming of little differences in intensity. The conscience of death, in this sense, is the matrix of the psychic system. It is double because it is that which can only be thought, or death from within, as Deleuze says, and that which cannot be thought, or death from without. It is an inevitable aspect or reaction to the process of individuation of the mind. Desired from within, death always comes from without in a passive and accidental form. Suicide is an attempt to make the two incommensurable faces coincide or correspond. However, the two sides do not meet, and every death remains double. On the one hand, it is a de-differentiation which compensates for the differentiations of the I and the self in an overall system which renders these uniform. On the other hand, it is a manner of individuation, a protest by the individual which has never recognized itself within the limits of the self and the I, even where these are universal. Similarly to death, the other understood as the figure of otherness expresses this encounter between the inside and the outside, so it constitutes the second center of envelopment of the mind. Neither subject nor object, the other is not you or I, but a third instance beyond representation. The other who is nobody, but who is self for the other and the other for the self, in two systems. The a priori other is defined in each system by its expressive value. In other words, its implicit and enveloping value. Consider a terrified face, under conditions such that I do not see and do not experience the causes of this terror. This face expresses a possible world, the terrifying world, the other as the expression of a possible world. The encounter with the other expresses a difference by expressing a possible world. It is in itself a great mystery which invites for a certain ethical conscience, a certain way to behave in order to preserve one's integrity as well as that of the other. The rule invoked earlier, not to be explicated too much, meant above all not to explicate oneself too much with the other, not to explicate the other too much, but to maintain one's implicit values, and multiply one's own world by populating it with all those expresseds that do not exist apart from their expressions. The specificity of the other in the psychic system is that it confers a position of reality to otherness through language. The other surprises us in speech. We forget if it is the image in the mirror that reflects us or if it is we ourselves who are following a higher reality. It is the problem in its purest form, which is also the culmination of eternal return, since the other remains, by definition, different. It is the ultimate moment of the crystal, the innermost echo of difference. The structure of the other and the corresponding function of language effectively represent the manifestation of the Numenon, the appearance of expressive values. In short, the tendency towards the interiorization of difference. Let us conclude with something that Deleuze said a little bit earlier in this chapter, which may be one of the most beautiful passages in difference and repetition, the promise of a universe saved from uniformization and heat death. If the eternal return reduces qualities to the status of pure signs and retains of extensities only what combines with the original depth, even at the cost of our coherence and in favor of a superior coherence, then the most beautiful qualities will appear, the most brilliant colors, the most precious stones and the most vibrant extensions. For once reduced to their seminal reasons, and having broken all relation with the negative, these will remain forever affixed in the intensive space of positive differences. Then in turn, the final prediction of the Phaedo will be realized, in which Plato promised to the sensibility disconnected from its empirical exercise temples, stars and gods, such as had never been seen before, unheard of affirmations. The prediction is realized, it is true, only by the very overturning of Platonism. In the next video, we will study the conclusion of difference and repetition, which functions a little bit as a summary of Deleuze's long research. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to all my incredible patrons. Thank you for your generosity and encouragement. It really means the world to me. So, thank you so much. And also, thanks to all of you for still being here after 8 videos on this topic. It's a great honor and pleasure to share this journey with you guys. Thank you all for watching, and see you soon.